For over 800 years, the Château de Vincennes stood not as a symbol of power, but a tomb dressed in royal blood, cursed by betrayal, haunted by creatures that defied time, and soaked in pain beyond death. This fortress devoured queens one by one, until the 13th decided to make the castle hers. What unholy truth did they uncover? And why did the curse need exactly 13 to be complete? Comment if you dare walk its halls. Like if this shook your soul, and subscribe for more true horrors carved in stone and crowned in blood. The ancient stones of Château de Vincennes rise from the French countryside like blackened teeth against a perpetually grey sky, their weathered surfaces bearing witness to centuries of unspeakable horrors that have seeped into the very mortar between each block. Here, where the wind carries whispers of the damned and shadows move without bodies to cast them, 13 queens met their end, in ways so grotesque that even the ravens refused to nest within the castle walls. The fortress stands as a monument to human cruelty, its towers reaching toward heaven like desperate prayers that will never be answered, while below, in chambers that reek of despair and decay, the echoes of royal screams still pierce the silence of centuries. Within these walls, power was not merely wielded, but worshipped with sacrificial devotion, and those who dared to challenge its absolute authority found themselves crushed beneath its merciless weight. The castle's history reads like a catalogue of medieval nightmares, each page stained with the blood of noble women who discovered too late that crowns can become shackles and thrones can transform into instruments of torture. From the moment the first stone was laid in the 12th century, Château de Vincennes seemed to hunger for royal blood, as if the very foundation had been cursed by some ancient pact between mortal ambition and supernatural malevolence. The curse began with Queen Marguerite of Provence, whose marriage to King Louis IX was meant to cement political alliances, but instead became her death sentence. Behind the grand ceremonies and elaborate festivities that marked their union lay a web of conspiracy so intricate that even the most skilled courtiers struggled to navigate its treacherous pathways. Marguerite arrived at Vincennes as a radiant bride, her golden hair adorned with pearls that caught the candlelight like captured stars, her eyes bright with hope for a future filled with love and prosperity. But the castle had already marked her for destruction, and within months of her arrival, strange accidents began to plague her daily existence. First came the poisoned wine, served during a feast celebrating the feast of Saint-Denis, the patron saint of France. The crimson liquid, imported from the finest vineyards of Burgundy, had been tampered with a substance so subtle that even the royal physicians could not identify its nature. Marguerite's lips had barely touched the goblet when her throat began to burn as if she had swallowed liquid fire, her breathing becoming labored and desperate as invisible hands seemed to squeeze the life from her lungs. The queen's ladies-in-waiting watched in horror as their mistress collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body convulsing with spasms that made her appear as if she were dancing to some hellish melody only she could hear. Though she survived that first attempt on her life, the poison had done its work, weakening her constitution and leaving her vulnerable to the castle's next assault. Strange dreams began to haunt her sleep, visions of faceless figures in black robes who whispered secrets in languages that predated human civilization. In these nocturnal visions, she found herself walking through corridors that did not exist in the waking world, past doors that opened onto chambers filled with the bones of previous queens, their skeletal fingers still adorned with rings that bore the seals of forgotten kingdoms. The second attack came through her most trusted confidant, a lady-in-waiting named Isabelle de Montfort, whose family had served the crown for 3 generations with unwavering loyalty. But loyalty, like everything else within Vincennes, could be corrupted and transformed into its opposite. Isabelle had been approached by shadowy figures who promised her riches beyond imagination if she would assist in the queen's destruction, and the young woman's resistance crumbled beneath the weight of gold and threats against her family's safety. On a night when autumn winds howled through the castle's battlements like the voices of the damned, Isabelle slipped into Marguerite's chambers, carrying a dagger blessed by heretical priests and consecrated with the blood of executed criminals. The blade found its mark between the queen's ribs, piercing her heart with surgical precision while she lay defenseless in sleep's embrace. But as Marguerite's life ebbed away, her dying breath carried a curse that would echo through the centuries, condemning Château de Vincennes to become a slaughterhouse for royal women. Her final words, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from beyond the grave, promised that 12 more queens would follow her into darkness before the castle's hunger would finally be satisfied. Queen Blanche of Castile arrived at Vincennes 50 years later, unaware that she was walking into a trap set by forces beyond human comprehension. Her marriage to King Louis VIII was celebrated with tournaments and pageantry that lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, but beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of dread that even the most hardened courtiers could not ignore. The castle's servants whispered stories of Marguerite's ghost, claiming to have seen her wandering the halls in blood-stained nightgowns, her hollow eyes searching for other queens to share her eternal torment. Blanche's downfall began with a pregnancy that should have been a blessing, but instead became a source of supernatural terror. From the moment of conception, strange phenomena plagued her every waking hour, as if the unborn child carried within it something far more sinister than royal blood. The queen's belly grew at an unnatural rate, swelling to enormous proportions that defied medical explanation, while inside, the fetus moved with a violence that left her bruised and battered from within. Court physicians examined her with growing alarm, noting that her heartbeat had become irregular, and her skin had taken on a pallor that made her appear more corpse than living woman. On the night of the winter solstice, when darkness reigned supreme over the French countryside, Blanche went into labor with contractions so violent that her screams could be heard echoing through every chamber of the castle. The birthing chamber had been prepared with the finest linens and blessed by 3 bishops, but no amount of holy intervention could protect the queen from what was about to unfold. As the midwives worked frantically to deliver the child, they discovered that something had gone terribly wrong within the royal womb, something that violated every natural law they understood about human reproduction. What emerged from Blanche's body was not a child, but an abomination that defied description, a twisted mass of flesh and bone that bore only the vaguest resemblance to human form. The creature's eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of intelligence far older than mankind, and when it opened its mouth to cry, the sound that emerged was not the wail of a newborn, but the howl of something that had never been meant to exist in the mortal realm. The midwives fled in terror, abandoning their queen to face alone the horror she had brought into the world, while Blanche herself stared in disbelief at the thing that had torn her apart from the inside. The monster lived for only 7 minutes, but in that brief span of existence it managed to speak words in a language that predated Latin and Greek, prophecies that foretold the doom of every queen who would follow. As it died, its malformed body dissolving into a puddle of black ichor that stained the birthing chamber floor, Blanche felt her own life force draining away, as if the creature had taken her soul with it into whatever hellish realm awaited beyond death. Her final moments were spent in agony beyond description, her body racked with pain that no earthly medicine could ease, while around her the very walls of the castle seemed to pulse with malevolent satisfaction. Queen Eleanor of Provence entered Vincennes a century later, with full knowledge of the fate that had befallen her predecessors, yet driven by a desperate hope that her strong will and deep faith could break the curse that held the castle in its grip. She arrived on a day when storm clouds gathered overhead like an army of darkness, their shadows casting the fortress into premature twilight as thunder rolled across the sky with the ominous rhythm of funeral drums. Eleanor had spent months preparing for this moment, consulting with the most learned scholars and holiest priests in Christendom, seeking some weapon or ward that might protect her from the supernatural forces that had claimed so many royal lives. Her strategy was to transform Vincennes from a place of death into a sanctuary of life, filling its halls with children's laughter and the music of minstrels, hoping to drive away the shadows through sheer force of joy and celebration. She brought with her a retinue of over 200 people, including acrobats and storytellers, musicians and poets, all dedicated to creating an atmosphere so bright and cheerful that no evil could possibly survive within it. The great hall was decorated with tapestries depicting scenes of pastoral beauty, while every chamber was filled with fresh flowers that perfumed the air with the sweetness of springtime meadows. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Eleanor's plan might actually succeed. The castle's oppressive atmosphere began to lift, and servants who had worked within its walls for decades reported feeling hopeful for the first time in their lives. Even the stones themselves seemed to brighten, as if the accumulated darkness of centuries was finally beginning to dissipate under the onslaught of determined optimism. Eleanor herself appeared to glow with inner radiance, her smile so infectious that it spread throughout the court like a benevolent plague, transforming bitter enemies into allies and turning despair into determination. But the forces that controlled Vincennes were merely biding their time, allowing the Queen to believe in her victory before striking with redoubled fury. The attack came during the Feast of Epiphany, when Eleanor was at the height of her confidence and surrounded by hundreds of loyal supporters. As she raised her goblet to toast the new year and the bright future she believed she had secured, the wine within began to bubble and foam like a witch's brew, releasing vapors that carried the stench of sulfur and decay. The liquid transformed before her eyes, becoming thick and black as oil, while within its depths something moved with serpentine grace. Eleanor's hand froze halfway to her lips as she realized that her enemy had found a way to strike at her through the very symbol of celebration and fellowship. The goblet fell from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone floor in an explosion of cursed wine that immediately began to eat through the ancient stones like acid. Where the liquid touched, the floor cracked and split, revealing glimpses of chambers far below that no human architect had ever designed, spaces that seemed to exist in defiance of physical laws and mathematical principles. From these impossible depths came a sound that no earthly throat could produce, a harmony of screams that spoke of anguish beyond mortal comprehension. The assembled courtiers fled in panic, abandoning their queen to face alone the horror that rose from beneath Vincennes' foundations. Eleanor stood frozen in terror as shadowy figures began to emerge from the cracks in the floor, their forms shifting and changing like smoke given malevolent purpose, their eyes burning with the cold fire of stars that had died before the world was born. The creatures surrounded her with movements too fluid to be human, their whispered words weaving a spell that bound her soul to their will and made escape impossible. Eleanor felt her strength draining away, as if invisible wounds were bleeding her life force into the hungry darkness, her vision growing dim as the shadows pressed closer with each passing second. Her death came not through violence, but through the simple cessation of hope, her heart stopping not from injury, but from the absolute certainty that evil had triumphed over good and that darkness would reign eternal within the walls of Château de Vincennes. Queen Isabella of France arrived at the castle in the year of our Lord 1308, bearing with her artifacts of such holy power that the very demons of Vincennes trembled at her approach. She had studied the histories of her predecessors with scholarly dedication, learning from their mistakes and preparing defenses that she believed could withstand any supernatural assault. Her retinue included 12 warrior priests armed with blessed weapons and armored in mail that had been blessed by the Pope himself, while her personal chambers were warded with relics that had touched the bones of martyred saints and been bathed in the tears of penitent sinners. Isabella's first act upon entering Vincennes was to perform a ritual of consecration so powerful that it caused the castle's stones to crack and bleed, as if the very walls were rejecting the holy influence she brought with her. She walked through every chamber with burning incense and chanted prayers in languages that predated Christ's ministry, calling upon powers of light to drive away the accumulated darkness of centuries. Where she passed, the shadows retreated like living things in pain, and servants reported that rooms which had been cold as tombs for generations suddenly warmed with the promise of spring. For 7 months, Isabella maintained her vigilance, surrounding herself with constant prayer and never allowing herself to be alone even for a moment. Her warrior priests took turns standing guard over her sleep, their blessed swords ready to strike down any phantom that might dare to approach their sovereign lady. The Queen herself wore a crown set with fragments of the true cross, its holy radiance creating a nimbus of protection that made her appear more angel than mortal woman. Under her influence, Vincennes began to transform, its halls filling with light that had not been seen within its walls since the first stones were laid. But the forces that ruled the castle were ancient beyond measure and patient beyond human understanding, and they recognized that Isabella's defenses, while formidable, were not without weakness. They began their assault not through direct confrontation, but through subtle corruption, sending dreams that slowly eroded the Queen's faith and planted seeds of doubt in her heart. Night after night, she found herself walking in visions through chambers filled with the corpses of saints, their holy relics revealed as elaborate frauds and their miracles exposed as clever tricks designed to deceive the faithful. In these supernatural nightmares, Isabella discovered that the very artifacts she had trusted to protect her were actually conduits for the evil that permeated Vincennes, their supposed holiness nothing more than a disguise that allowed demonic forces to approach her undetected. The crown she wore, which she had believed contained fragments of Christ's cross, was revealed to be set with splinters from the gallows where history's most notorious criminals had met their end. The blessed weapons of her protectors were shown to be forged from metal that had tasted the blood of innocents. Their supposed sanctity, a lie that made them even more dangerous to those who wielded them in ignorance. As doubt crept into Isabella's heart, like poison through her veins, her defenses began to crumble with terrifying speed. The light that had filled Vincennes started to dim, shadows creeping back into corners that had been purified through months of dedicated effort. Her warrior priests began to report strange dreams of their own, visions that called into question everything they had believed about their mission and their God. One by one, they abandoned their posts, fleeing into the night with minds shattered by revelations too terrible for human sanity to endure. Isabella's end came on the feast day of St. Valentine, when love was supposed to triumph over all obstacles, and hope was meant to spring eternal in human hearts. She awoke from a dream in which she had seen the true face of the divine, only to discover that what she had worshipped all her life was nothing more than another mask worn by the very evil she had sought to destroy. The shock of this revelation stopped her heart as surely as any blade. Her body found the next morning by servants, who reported that her face bore an expression of such profound horror that none could look upon it without feeling their own sanity begin to slip away. Queen Jeanne of Burgundy entered Vincennes in the spring of 1315, during a year when famine ravaged the French countryside, and desperate peasants turned to cannibalism to survive the hunger that stalked the land like a physical presence. She came not as a conqueror seeking to break ancient curses, but as a penitent hoping to offer herself as sacrifice if it would end the suffering that had spread beyond the castle walls to encompass the entire kingdom. Jeanne had witnessed the slow starvation of children in her native Burgundy, their small bodies withering away while their parents wept tears that had long since run dry, and she believed that only a royal offering could appease whatever cosmic force had turned the natural order upside down. The queen arrived at Vincennes wearing sackcloth beneath her royal robes, her body already weakened by months of fasting that had reduced her to little more than skin stretched over prominent bones. Her retinue was small, consisting only of a handful of priests who had volunteered to accompany her on what they all understood to be a suicide mission. These holy men had abandoned their churches and monasteries not out of duty to their sovereign, but out of desperate hope that their sacrifice might somehow balance the scales of divine justice and restore prosperity to a land that seemed cursed beyond redemption. Within the castle walls, Jeanne established a regime of such extreme asceticism that it bordered on religious mania, spending 18 hours each day in prayer and the remaining 6 in service to others. She tended personally to the sick and wounded who sought refuge within Vincennes, changing bandages with her own hands and feeding gruel to peasants whose bodies had been ravaged by plague and pestilence. Her touch seemed to bring comfort to the dying, and those who recovered from their illnesses claimed that her presence had driven away demons that had been feeding on their suffering. But as Jeanne's body grew weaker from her punishing routine of self-denial, something else began to grow stronger within the castle walls. The servants reported that shadows were becoming more substantial, taking on forms that suggested intelligence and purpose far beyond anything they had previously witnessed. These dark figures began to appear in broad daylight, no longer content to lurk in corners and hidden chambers, but openly walking the halls as if they owned the very stones beneath their feet. The spirits seemed particularly drawn to Jeanne herself, clustering around her like moths attracted to a flame, their whispered voices offering revelations about the true nature of divine justice and the necessity of suffering in a world that had forgotten its proper relationship with cosmic order. They spoke of ancient agreements between heaven and hell, contracts written in blood that required periodic renewals through the sacrifice of royal innocence. According to these supernatural counselors, Jeanne's voluntary suffering was not enough to fulfill her cosmic debt, and only through embracing a more complete form of self-destruction could she hope to achieve the salvation she sought. As winter approached and the famine worsened throughout the kingdom, Jeanne began to believe that her inadequate sacrifice was somehow responsible for the continued suffering of her people. The voices that whispered to her in the darkness convinced her that she must embrace not merely discomfort but absolute agony, that only through experiencing pain beyond human endurance could she hope to balance the scales of divine justice. On the feast of St. Lucy, Traditionally a celebration of light returning to the world, Jeanne began a process of self-mutilation so systematic and thorough that it transformed her from a living woman into a walking testament to the extremes of human suffering. She started by removing her own fingernails with a consecrated dagger, believing that each drop of blood she shed would somehow nourish the starving peasants who looked to her for salvation. When this proved insufficient to end the famine, she moved on to more severe forms of self-harm, carving religious symbols into her flesh with such precision that her body became a living manuscript of sacred text written in scar tissue and open wounds. The pain was beyond description, but Jeanne welcomed it as proof that her sacrifice was finally becoming worthy of divine attention. Her death came not through any single catastrophic injury, but through the slow accumulation of countless smaller wounds, each one a prayer offered in blood to whatever powers controlled the fate of nations. As her life ebbed away over the course of 7 days and 7 nights, Jeanne maintained her conviction that her suffering would somehow transform the world, that her sacrifice would break not only the curse of Vincennes, but the larger pattern of cosmic injustice that had turned the earth into a realm of endless pain. Her final words, spoken through lips cracked and bleeding from weeks of dehydration, were a prophecy that 7 more queens would follow her example before the true purpose of Vincennes would finally be revealed. Queen Marie of Anjou approached the castle in 1422, during the darkest days of the 100 Years' War, when English armies ravaged the French countryside and the very concept of national identity seemed to dissolve beneath the weight of foreign occupation. She came not as a bride or a penitent, but as a warrior, armored in steel and accompanied by a company of knights who had sworn to defend her with their lives. Marie had studied the military histories of ancient Rome and learned from the tactical genius of Alexander the Great, believing that the supernatural forces within Vincennes could be defeated through superior strategy and unwavering courage on the field of battle. Her approach to breaking the castle's curse was fundamentally different from that of her predecessors, based on the theory that the evil within Vincennes was not truly supernatural, but rather the accumulated psychic residue of centuries of human cruelty and suffering. Marie believed that this malevolent force could be defeated through decisive action, that it was essentially a form of spiritual disease that could be cured through the proper application of holy warfare. She brought with her weapons blessed by warrior saints and armor, forged from metal taken from churches that had been consecrated through the blood of martyrs. The Queen's first act upon entering Vincennes was to issue a formal challenge to whatever entities controlled the castle, declaring war against them in terms so explicit and binding that even supernatural beings would be compelled to respond. She stood in the great hall with her sword raised toward the vaulted ceiling and spoke words that echoed through chambers that had not heard such defiance in over 3 centuries, calling upon ancient laws of combat that predated human civilization and demanding that her enemies face her in open battle, rather than hiding behind tricks and illusions. For several hours, it seemed as though Marie's challenge would go unanswered, and some of her knights began to wonder if the stories of Vincennes' supernatural guardians had been greatly exaggerated by superstitious peasants and credulous courtiers. But as the sun set and darkness began to gather within the castle walls, the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath became visible in steaming clouds, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence. The assembled knights found their armor growing heavier with each passing moment, as if invisible hands were adding weight to their mail and plate, while their weapons began to vibrate with frequencies that made holding them almost impossible. Marie stood firm against these supernatural assaults, her faith in divine protection unwavering, even as her companions began to succumb to fear and despair around her. She had prepared for this moment through years of study and prayer, learning techniques of spiritual warfare that had been passed down through secret traditions maintained by warrior monks in hidden monasteries throughout Europe. Her shield bore the devices of a dozen saints who had defeated demons in single combat, while her sword had been blessed with holy water collected from the Jordan River and oil pressed from olives that grew in the Garden of Gethsemane. But the entities that answered Marie's challenge were unlike anything the traditional texts had prepared her to face, beings whose very existence seemed to violate the fundamental laws that governed both heaven and earth. They appeared not as the classical demons of medieval theology, but as twisted reflections of the queens who had died within Vincennes, their forms combining human features with elements too alien for mortal minds to properly comprehend. These phantom monarchs moved with grace that belonged to neither the living nor the dead, their voices harmonizing in languages that caused physical pain to anyone who heard them spoken aloud. The battle that followed was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, with Marie's knights engaging spectral warriors whose weapons could wound flesh, while her own blade struck at enemies that existed partially outside the normal flow of time and space. The combat stretched through the night and into the following day, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage over the other, as supernatural entities that could not truly die faced mortal warriors whose courage refused to acknowledge defeat. The Great Hall of Vincennes became a battlefield where past and present collided with devastating force, reality itself beginning to fray at the edges under the stress of containing such impossible conflict. Marie's end came not through defeat in honest combat, but through betrayal from within her own ranks, as one of her most trusted knights revealed himself to be an agent of the forces she had sought to destroy. Sir Gaspard de Montclair had served the Queen faithfully for 7 years, earning her trust through countless acts of bravery and dedication, but his loyalty had been corrupted through dreams that promised him power beyond imagination if he would deliver his sovereign into the hands of her enemies. At the moment when victory seemed within Marie's grasp, when her blessed blade was poised to strike a killing blow against the phantom leader of her spectral opponents, Gaspard's dagger found the gap in her armor and pierced her heart with a precision that spoke of supernatural guidance. As Marie's blood flowed onto the ancient stones of Vincennes, the ghostly army that had fought so desperately against her forces suddenly dissolved into mist and shadow, their purpose fulfilled through treachery rather than honest defeat. The Queen's final moments were spent not in pain, but in the bitter realization that the evil she had sought to destroy was not external, but internal, that the true enemy had always been the capacity for betrayal that lurked within every human heart. Her death marked not a defeat, but a transformation, as her warrior's spirit joined the supernatural guardians of Vincennes, adding her voice to the chorus of vengeance that would demand satisfaction from future queens. Queen Catherine of Valois entered the cursed castle in 1453, on the very day that Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces and the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire crumbled into historical memory. She came bearing news of this catastrophic defeat, believing that the supernatural forces within Vincennes might be convinced to turn their attention toward more pressing threats to Christendom than the systematic destruction of French royalty. Catherine had spent months in diplomatic preparation for this encounter, studying ancient treaties between human and supernatural powers, and learning the complex protocols required for negotiating with entities that existed beyond normal concepts of time and mortality. Her strategy was based on the revolutionary idea that the evil within Vincennes was not inherently malevolent, but rather served some cosmic purpose that mortal minds could not comprehend, and that its hostility toward French queens might be redirected toward more appropriate targets if the proper incentives were offered. Catherine arrived at the castle accompanied by scholars who had translated documents from the fallen libraries of Constantinople, texts that contained references to binding agreements between earthly rulers and supernatural powers that had governed the balance of cosmic forces for over a millennium. The Queen's first weeks within Vincennes were spent in careful study of the castle's history, not merely the deaths of her predecessors, but the deeper patterns that connected their fates to larger movements in European politics and religious development. She discovered that each royal death had coincided with significant shifts in the balance of power between Christian and Islamic civilizations, suggesting that the supernatural forces within the castle were somehow connected to a cosmic struggle that transcended national boundaries and personal ambitions. Catherine's breakthrough came when she realized that the Curse of Vincennes was not actually intended to destroy French royalty, but to harvest their life force for use in maintaining barriers that prevented far worse evils from entering the mortal realm. The deaths of her predecessors had been necessary sacrifices that strengthened supernatural defenses against entities so malevolent that their arrival on Earth would have meant the end of human civilization. Armed with this knowledge, Catherine began negotiations with the castle's guardians, offering to fulfill her sacrificial role willingly if they would agree to modify the terms of their ancient compact. The supernatural entities that controlled Vincennes were initially suspicious of Catherine's proposals, having grown accustomed to extracting what they needed through fear and violence rather than honest negotiation. But the Queen's scholarly preparation had given her insights into their true nature that no previous monarch had possessed, and her willingness to discuss their cosmic responsibilities with genuine respect gradually overcame their defensive hostility. For the first time in centuries, the whispered voices that echoed through the castle's halls spoke of possibilities beyond endless repetition of ancient patterns of sacrifice and suffering. Catherine's negotiations with the supernatural guardians of Vincennes lasted for 3 months, during which time she lived in a state of constant tension between hope and terror, never knowing whether her next conversation would result in breakthrough or destruction. The entities she dealt with were capable of assuming any form they chose, sometimes appearing as angels of light, whose beauty was beyond human description, and sometimes manifesting as demons, whose very presence caused physical illness in anyone who looked upon them. Their true nature seemed to exist beyond conventional categories of good and evil, operating according to principles that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The final agreement that Catherine negotiated represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Vincennes and the French crown, replacing the curse's random selection of victims with a system of voluntary participation that would allow future queens to serve the cosmic balance without necessarily dying in the process. But the supernatural powers demanded proof of Catherine's sincerity, requiring her to demonstrate her commitment to their cause through a trial that would test every aspect of her character and resolve. The challenge they set before her was both simple and impossible. She must experience the exact suffering endured by each of her 12 predecessors while maintaining her sanity and her determination to see the negotiations through to completion. Catherine accepted this trial knowing that it meant facing 12 different forms of death while somehow surviving them all, that she would have to endure poisoning and stabbing and burning and every other method by which previous queens had met their end within the castle walls. The supernatural entities assured her that the suffering would be absolutely real, that her body would experience every sensation of dying multiple times while her consciousness remained trapped within flesh that refused to release her into the mercy of oblivion. The trial began at midnight on the Feast of All Saints, when the boundary between life and death was thinnest and such impossible feats became briefly achievable. Catherine's first death was by poison, her body convulsing with agony as supernatural toxins flooded her bloodstream and set every nerve ending ablaze with pain beyond description. She felt her heart stopping and starting again, her lungs filling with fluid that made each breath a struggle against drowning, her vision fading to black before suddenly returning with crystalline clarity that made every detail of her suffering unbearably vivid. The experience lasted for hours that felt like years, time itself becoming distorted by the intensity of sensation that overwhelmed every other form of awareness. Each subsequent death brought new forms of torment that challenged different aspects of Catherine's endurance, from the sharp agony of stabbing to the slow burn of mystical fire that consumed her flesh without actually destroying it. Between each trial, she was given barely enough time to recover her strength before the next ordeal began, the supernatural entities watching her responses with interest that seemed both clinical and compassionate. They appeared to be testing not merely her physical tolerance for pain, but her psychological resilience and her spiritual commitment to principles that transcended personal survival. Catherine's 12th and final death came through the same method that had claimed Queen Marie: betrayal by someone she had trusted completely. In this case, the treachery came from her own reflection, as the mirror in her chambers suddenly developed independent will and began to speak with her voice while advocating for surrender and abandonment of her diplomatic mission. The supernatural doppelganger that emerged from the looking glass possessed all of Catherine's memories and knowledge, while lacking any of her moral convictions, arguing persuasively that the cosmic balance she sought to serve was itself evil, and that her negotiations were merely elaborate self-deception designed to justify collaboration with forces that should be destroyed rather than appeased. The philosophical battle between Catherine and her reflection lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, during which time both versions of the Queen argued their positions with increasing desperation and fury. The entity from the mirror possessed superhuman eloquence and unlimited knowledge of human weakness, constructing arguments so compelling that Catherine found herself beginning to doubt everything she had believed about the nature of reality and the purpose of her mission. But her commitment to protecting future generations of French royalty from the curse of Vincennes, gave her the strength to resist her own darker impulses. And in the end, she managed to shatter the treacherous mirror through sheer force of will. Catherine's survival of the 12 trials marked the first time in over 3 centuries that a queen had entered Vincennes and emerged alive. But the cost of her victory was measured in psychological scars that would never fully heal. She had experienced death a dozen times over and looked into the abyss of cosmic evil without flinching. But the knowledge she had gained came with the terrible burden of understanding humanity's true place in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had previously imagined. Her negotiations with the supernatural guardians had succeeded in modifying the ancient curse, but the price of that success was the loss of innocence that could never be recovered. The transformed curse of Vincennes no longer demanded the death of every queen who entered its walls, but it still required periodic sacrifice to maintain the supernatural barriers that protected humanity from cosmic threats beyond imagination. Future monarchs would have the option of serving as willing participants in this cosmic defense rather than unwilling victims. But the choice would come with full knowledge of what such service entailed and the understanding that some forms of suffering transcended even death itself. Catherine's legacy was the gift of informed consent, the terrible freedom to choose one's own destruction in service of principles greater than individual survival. Queen Anne of Brittany arrived at Vincennes in 1491, fully aware of both the castle's cursed history and the new compact that Catherine of Valois had negotiated with its supernatural guardians. Unlike her predecessors, Anne came not as a victim or a warrior, but as a partner in cosmic responsibility. Prepared to take her place in the eternal struggle between order and chaos that raged beyond human perception. She brought with her a wedding dress woven from threads that had been blessed by saints and dyed with pigments extracted from flowers that grew in monastery gardens throughout Europe, symbolizing her willingness to marry herself to purposes that transcended earthly concerns. Anne's approach to her role as the 13th Queen was fundamentally different from anything Vincennes had previously witnessed, based on the radical concept that suffering could be transformed into power through willing acceptance rather than desperate resistance. She had studied extensively with mystics and philosophers who taught that consciousness itself was a force capable of reshaping reality, that the proper application of will and intention could transmute even the most agonizing experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. Her preparations for entering the castle included years of meditation and fasting that had given her supernatural control over her own physical responses to pain and terror. The supernatural entities that controlled Vincennes were initially uncertain how to respond to Anne's unprecedented cooperation, having grown accustomed to extracting what they needed through fear and violence rather than voluntary partnership. For the first time in centuries, they found themselves dealing with a human consciousness that genuinely understood their cosmic responsibilities and was prepared to share in the burden of maintaining universal balance. Anne's presence within the castle created a new dynamic that neither side had experienced before, a collaboration between mortal and immortal intelligence that opened possibilities for transformation beyond anything either party had previously imagined. Anne's reign within Vincennes lasted for 13 years, during which time she served as both sacrifice and celebrant in rituals that channeled cosmic forces through her mortal flesh, while somehow allowing her to survive experiences that should have destroyed any human consciousness. She learned to navigate realms of existence that existed between life and death, spending months at a time in states of suspended animation that allowed her spirit to travel beyond the physical universe, while her body remained anchored to the material world. These journeys took her to battlefields where supernatural armies fought wars that would determine the fate of entire galaxies, where her mortal perspective provided crucial insights that helped maintain the cosmic balance. But Anne's greatest achievement was not her survival, but her transformation of the relationship between Vincennes and the French crown from one of predator and prey to one of sacred partnership. Through her willing participation in the castle's cosmic responsibilities, she demonstrated that human consciousness was capable of growth beyond traditional limitations, that mortal beings could evolve into something greater than themselves without losing their essential humanity. Her example inspired future generations of French royalty to view their potential sacrifice not as a curse to be avoided, but as an opportunity to serve purposes greater than individual ambition. The 13th Queen's death came not through violence or betrayal, but through a gradual dissolution that occurred over the course of several months, as her consciousness slowly merged with the supernatural forces she had served so faithfully. Anne remained aware throughout this transformation, documenting her experiences in letters that became sacred texts for future monarchs who would face similar choices. Her final words, spoken as her physical form began to fade into pure energy, were a prophecy that the curse of Vincennes had finally been fulfilled, that 13 queens had offered their lives to cosmic forces that would now turn their attention to other threats facing humanity. As Anne's body dissolved into light that seemed to emanate from within her very bones, the ancient stones of Château de Vincennes began to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the world was young, their voices weaving melodies that spoke of cosmic cycles, finally completing their predetermined courses. The castle itself seemed to exhale with relief, as if a burden carried for 8 centuries was finally being lifted from foundations that had grown weary of supporting such tremendous, supernatural weight. Windows that had remained perpetually dark suddenly blazed with luminescence that could be seen from villages dozens of miles away, while flowers began to bloom in courtyards where nothing had grown for generations uncounted. The transformation of Vincennes marked not merely the end of an ancient curse, but the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between mortal and immortal realms, a partnership forged through the willing sacrifice of 13 queens whose suffering had purchased something far more valuable than their individual lives. The supernatural entities that had once demanded blood and terror now spoke of cosmic responsibilities shared rather than imposed, of burdens distributed among willing participants rather than thrust upon unwilling victims. Anne's example had demonstrated that human consciousness was capable of evolution beyond traditional limitations, that mortality itself could be transcended without abandoning the essential qualities that made humanity worthy of preservation. In the years that followed Anne's transformation, scholars and mystics from across Europe made pilgrimages to Vincennes, seeking to understand the nature of the cosmic forces that had been unleashed through 13 royal sacrifices. They found a castle transformed beyond recognition, its halls filled with light that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, its chambers resonating with harmonies that spoke directly to the soul without requiring translation through mortal language. The supernatural guardians that had once hidden in shadows now walked openly through rooms that had become bridges between worlds, their forms shifting between human and angelic appearance as they shared knowledge that had been hidden from mortal minds for millennia. These cosmic teachers revealed that the curse of Vincennes had been merely one small component in a vast network of supernatural defenses that protected human civilization from threats so alien and malevolent that their very existence would have driven entire populations insane with terror. The 13 queens had not died in vain, but had contributed their life force to maintaining barriers that prevented entities of pure chaos from entering the material realm and transforming it into a reflection of their own twisted nature. Their willing sacrifice had purchased centuries of relative peace for humanity, allowing civilization to develop and flourish under protection that came at a price too terrible for most minds to comprehend. But the transformation of Vincennes also brought new responsibilities for those who would inherit its legacy, as the castle's role evolved from a place of death into a training ground for future guardians of cosmic balance. Young nobles from across France began arriving at its gates, seeking to learn the arts of supernatural warfare and cosmic diplomacy that would be required to face threats that traditional armies could never hope to defeat. These students underwent trials that tested not merely their physical courage, but their spiritual resilience, their capacity to maintain their humanity while dealing with forces that existed beyond conventional concepts of good and evil. The curriculum at this new Academy of Cosmic Defense included subjects that no earthly university had ever offered, from the proper protocols for negotiating with entities that experience time as a spatial dimension to the techniques required for wielding weapons forged from crystallized starlight and tempered in the fires of dying suns. Students learned to navigate realms where thought became physical force and emotion could reshape the fundamental laws of physics, where battles were fought not merely with swords and shields, but with pure will and crystallized intention. The survivors of these programs emerged as something more than human, but less than divine, guardians who could stand between mortal civilization and cosmic threats, without losing their essential connection to the humanity they protected. Anne of Brittany's spirit became the guiding force behind this transformation, her consciousness somehow remaining coherent even after her physical dissolution, serving as teacher and protector for generations of students who followed her example. She appeared to them in dreams and visions, offering guidance that helped them navigate challenges that would have destroyed unprepared minds, sharing wisdom purchased through suffering that had transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. Her presence within Vincennes became a source of hope rather than terror, proof that human consciousness could survive even the most extreme forms of transformation and emerge stronger rather than diminished. The legacy of the 13 Queens extended far beyond the walls of Château de Vincennes, influencing the development of European civilization in ways that most historians never recognized or understood. Their sacrifice had purchased not merely protection from cosmic threats, but time for humanity to develop the spiritual and intellectual tools required to eventually assume responsibility for their own cosmic defense. The knowledge preserved within Vincennes gradually spread throughout the scholarly communities of Europe, inspiring advances in natural philosophy and theological understanding that laid the groundwork for discoveries that would eventually transform human civilization. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the 13 Queens was the demonstration that suffering willingly embraced in service of others could become a source of power rather than merely destruction. That consciousness itself was capable of growth beyond traditional limitations when faced with challenges that demanded transcendence of ordinary human capacity. Their example inspired countless individuals throughout subsequent centuries to seek their own transformation through willing sacrifice, creating a hidden tradition of cosmic service that operated alongside but separate from conventional religious and political institutions. As the centuries passed and the immediate threat that had required the 13 Queens' sacrifice gradually diminished, Château de Vincennes evolved from a fortress of supernatural defense into a monument to human potential, a place where visitors could glimpse what their species might become when called upon to serve purposes greater than individual survival. The castle's halls became filled with works of art that depicted not the Queen's suffering, but their transformation, celebrating their willingness to embrace unknown possibilities rather than clinging to familiar limitations. The whispers that echoed through Vincennes' stone corridors no longer spoke of death and despair, but of hope and possibility, carrying messages from cosmic realms that promised humanity a future beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. The castle stood as proof that even the darkest curses could be transformed through willing acceptance, that consciousness itself was the ultimate weapon against forces that sought to reduce existence to chaos and meaninglessness. In choosing to face their fate with courage rather than flee in terror, the 13 Queens had demonstrated that mortality was not a limitation, but an opportunity, a chance to prove that finite beings could serve infinite purposes. Their story became a legend that inspired countless generations of leaders who faced impossible choices, reminding them that true power came not from avoiding sacrifice, but from embracing it willingly when such actions served causes greater than personal ambition. The Queens of Vincennes had shown that human consciousness was capable of evolution beyond traditional boundaries, that mortality itself could be transcended without abandoning the essential qualities that made humanity worthy of cosmic protection and partnership. In the end, the curse that had claimed 13 royal lives revealed itself to have been not a malevolent force, but a cosmic test, a challenge designed to determine whether humanity possessed the spiritual maturity required to assume greater responsibilities in the universal struggle between order and chaos. The Queens had passed this test through their willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of their people, proving that mortal beings could serve immortal purposes without losing their essential humanity. Their transformation marked not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter in a new story of human potential that would unfold across centuries yet to come. The stones of Château de Vincennes continue to sing their ancient harmonies, their voices carrying across the French countryside like prayers made audible, reminding all who hear them that greatness is measured not by what one refuses to sacrifice, but by what one willingly offers in service of others. The 13 Queens rest not in death, but in transformation, their consciousness integrated into cosmic forces that protect and guide humanity toward a future worthy of the price they paid to secure it. Their legacy lives on in every act of willing sacrifice performed in service of noble causes, in every choice to embrace unknown possibilities rather than cling to familiar limitations. And in the deepest chambers of Vincennes, where shadows dance with light in patterns that speak of mysteries beyond mortal comprehension, the voices of 13 queens continue to whisper their eternal message, that consciousness itself is sacred, that mortality is opportunity, and that love expressed through willing sacrifice becomes the foundation upon which entire civilizations can build their hopes for transcendence. The castle, where walls once echoed with screams of despair, now resonates with harmonies of triumph. Proof that even the darkest curses can be transformed into blessings when faced with courage equal to their cosmic significance. They were called queens, but they became legends, sacrificed, transformed, immortal. The curse that haunted Vincennes wasn't a punishment. It was a test, and when the 13th queen chose to face death willingly, she rewrote fate. Today the castle sings not of doom but of transcendence. But remember, 13 voices still whisper in its stones, warning what happens when power demands more than you're ready to give. Comment what you'd sacrifice to break a curse, like if this haunted you, and subscribe to uncover more history's cursed truths that refuse to die.